by Henry Warwick. This started off as a conversation between myself and Geert Loving several years ago. I was working on a PhD about post-carbon ICT, and when my research indicated that there was no such thing, I became very depressed. He asked me what I was up to otherwise, and I explained my musical interests and how I was collecting ebooks online and building my own library to help with my PhD research. And he said, "That's your PhD." He said, "You've spent your professional career democratizing digital media, fonts, internet design, digital video, and digital music, and now you're building a library." And I said, "Yeah, that's right." So with some further discussion, I came up with the idea of the Alexandria project, which would be a library on a hard drive that people could share, contribute to, edit, and otherwise help educate each other, because the original purpose of the library was learning. It also became clear that many other people were thinking similar thoughts, and I found a certain set of facts that were important in this regard. One, that libraries existed to copy data, and that libraries as warehouses was a recent idea, and not a very good one. Two, that the online world used to be considered rhizomatic, but recent events have proven that it is actually quite arboretic and precarious. We'll get into that in a little bit. Three, that a method of sharing files using hard drives is slow, but it's extremely resilient, and that this reversalism is a radical tactic against draconian proprietarianism. Four, there are forces and trends at work that are working against personal portable libraries, and we'll talk about those too. First, let's talk about libraries. Libraries started in ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets were collected. Clay tablets are pretty cool. If you treat them well, they can last thousands of years. That's why we know about them today. But if you drop one, it is prone to shatter, which means that it's really important that you always have more than one copy of something around, because if it breaks, you can copy the copy and have another backup to work from. Because these things broke with some frequency, the library became a big copy center. After that, the next big library was the storied Alexandria Library, which was actually two libraries, but we'll talk about it as one. The Alexandria Library was also a gigantic copy center because their documents were on scrolls made of papyrus, which tended to rot when wet or crumble when dry. So copies had to be made to manage the natural decay of the papyrus. It was also a huge copy center because the people who ran Alexandria, the Ptolemaic dynasty, were very aggressive about adding to the library, such that if you sailed to Alexandria, your boat would be searched, and any scrolls of note or value were confiscated, copied, and the copies were then given to the owners. This practice made Alexandria the biggest library ever. It got to be so big, they had to organize it, so they set up tables for different subjects of interest in the library, from philosophy to cookbooks to physics and history. These tables were the ancestor of database tables. Anyway, Ptolemy got greedy and decided to restrict the export of papyrus, and this resulted in the development of parchment, which led to the invention of books to replace scrolls. Alexandria burned down a few times and much was lost. In the interim, China and the Near East built libraries, and the monks and monasteries in European scriptoria all set about copying books. In China, India, and the Near East, they copied books of history, wisdom, and philosophy, and well as religion. In Europe, they tended to copy the Bible. This was slow and expensive, and production was limited, but this wasn't so bad because Europe was mostly illiterate anyway. Europe also had a belief in patron saints. There were saints for sailors, tailors, butchers, farmers, animals, anyone who needed protection, but not for copyists. Copyists had a patron demon named Titavillus. He would distract the copyist who would make mistakes. Since mistakes were always made, it made more sense to have a patron demon to blame than a patron saint to protect. Anyway, hackers also have a patron saint, Saint Expedite. Since hackers have a patron saint for protection, then it makes sense for digital copyists to have one, and that would be Metatron, the recording angel. And that's a tip of the hat to Saul Urich. So with the protection of Metatron, let us proceed to the next point. The development of movable type in Europe, which was copied from China, led to massive increases in literacy and the production of books other than the Bible. But books were still expensive and slow to produce until well into the 19th century when they developed pulp paper and rotary presses, another idea that had originated in China. But pulp paper changed all that. It allowed for the development and printing of countless millions of books, magazines, journals, advertisements, etc., and it all came at the price of mowing down jillions of square miles of forest. And with this amplification of book production, libraries changed character and became warehouses that existed at the luxury of those who owned the publishing rights to the books. But all that is relatively recent. If we look at the lunatic copyright laws of today that have only really been around since the 1970s and compare them to the tablets of Mesopotamia, say 2000 BCE, you can see that the warehouse library of today is a stunted, dull anomaly in a time of greed and excess, rather than the center of learning in the millennia of copying and collecting that had been going on previously. In this way, those making and collecting personal portable libraries are much more in the tradition of the historical norm of library development. Even in the 20th century, there has been personal portable libraries. An example would be Walter Benjamin, who carted trunks full of books around with him, or stuff a box or two to bring with him for research. All of his books and writings could have fit on a USB stick today. If he had that, perhaps history might have turned out differently. But he died decades before USB sticks were invented. In 1989, Andrew Tenenbaum said, "Never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon full of tapes hurtling down the highway." Well, nowadays we can say, never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon full of multi-terabyte hard drives hurtling down the highway. That is the promise inherent to the personal portable library, and it is a radical promise. Because around the time that Tenenbaum said that, the philosopher Deleuze and Guattari were talking about the rhizomatic, where, quote, as a model for culture, the rhizome resists the organizational structure of the root tree system, which charts causality along chronological lines and looks for the original sources of things and looks towards the pinnacle or conclusion of these things. A rhizome, on the other hand, is characterized by ceaselessly established connections between semiotic chains, organizations of power, and the circumstances relative to the arts, sciences, and social struggles. The opposite of the rhizomatic is the tree-like or the arboretic. Many people in the 1990s saw the rhizomatic as the model for understanding the internet, where every obstacle is worked around and where any particular node of the system is destroyed, the rhizomatic system compensates and grows around it. In the past several years, we have seen the actual reversal of this. The internet is no longer a rhizomatic structure, but arboretic, something that can be cut down and hacked to bits and killed. This is happening on several fronts. One, a move to cloud computing data lockers, and the other through the application of brute force by political and juridical actors. Things are so out of hand that legislation was proposed in the USA where someone sitting in his mother's basement who shared a copy of a song by Michael Jackson could have gone to jail longer than the doctor who actually killed Michael Jackson. In terms of the economic juridical power acting in the interests of capital and proprietarianism, we see a move to cloud computing where data is held in giant lockers in the electronic sky. You can access this data if you pay. Some data lockers allow you to access it if you don't pay, but the bandwidth is reduced, and even then they can be blown off the map by draconian copyright enforcers, such as the case with library.nu. Library.nu allowed people to download any of its 800,000 books for free, and it was eliminated by a consortium of textbook publishers who took them to court. Did other websites spring up to replace library.nu? Yes, but it wasn't fast. And while the replacement websites are larger and more powerful, they are increasingly precarious due to their size and complexity. If they get taken down, they could be gone for quite some time. And the point is, they can be taken down. And they can be taken down politically. The classic example of this was in Egypt, where the Mubarak regime wanted to disrupt the actions of protesters, so they literally shut down the internet. Did that stop the most tech-savvy among the protesters? No, they used satellite phones to get info in and out of Egypt, but it did prevent the vast majority of Egyptians from accessing information online. Mubarak figured that this would force the organizations into face-to-face type communications, which are slower and corruptible by spies. It didn't work out that way for him, but that's a different story. The point is, the online is now precarious. Governments regularly censor and seize internet access as they deem fit. and economic interests are busy acting to enclose the internet and subject it to vertical extraction. That is also another story, but it is also an obvious truth. From this we can conclude the online is precarious. The offline is